They were told it was impossible. They did it anyway. The race to the moon. On the night of October 4th, 1957, people across the United States walked out into their backyards and looked up at the sky. There, moving steadily across the stars, was a small point of light. Not a star. Not a plane. A man-made object, orbiting the Earth, beeping a simple radio signal that anyone with a shortwave receiver could pick up. It was called Sputnik, a Russian word meaning fellow traveler. It weighed less than 200 pounds. It did almost nothing except broadcast that steady beep, beep, beep. And it terrified the United States more thoroughly than almost anything since Pearl Harbor. Because the country that had built it was the Soviet Union. And the rocket that had carried it into space was powerful enough to carry something else. A nuclear warhead. Aimed at any city in America. 12 years later, on July 20th, 1969, 2 American astronauts stepped out onto the surface of the moon, 250,000 miles from Earth, while 600 million people, roughly 1 in every 6 human beings alive at the time, watched on television. How does a civilization go from a single beeping satellite to walking on another world in 12 years? Welcome to Sera History. I'm your host. Episode 13. Today we talk about the space race, the Apollo program, and the most audacious technological undertaking in the history of our species. This is a story about fear, about genius, about unimaginable amounts of money, about the deaths of brave people, and about a promise made by a young president who would not live to see it fulfilled. To understand why a beeping satellite caused a national panic, you have to understand the Cold War. By 1957, the United States and the Soviet Union had spent over a decade locked in a global ideological struggle. 2 superpowers, 2 systems of government, 2 visions for how human society should be organized, each possessing nuclear weapons capable of ending civilization, each believing the other represented an existential threat. The competition played out in proxy wars, in espionage, in propaganda, in the arms race. And now, with Sputnik, it had moved into space. The technical achievement was genuinely staggering. To put a satellite into orbit, you need a rocket powerful enough to accelerate an object to roughly 18,000 miles per hour, fast enough that as it falls toward Earth due to gravity, the curve of the Earth falls away beneath it at the same rate. That is what an orbit actually is. A continuous, controlled fall that never quite reaches the ground. The Soviet rocket that achieved this, derived from intercontinental ballistic missile technology developed under chief designer Sergei Korolev, demonstrated something deeply alarming to American military planners. If the Soviets could put an object into orbit, they could also deliver a nuclear warhead to any point on the globe with a missile, no bombers required, no warning beyond minutes. American confidence, built on the assumption of technological superiority, cracked overnight. A month later, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying a dog named Laika, the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Laika did not survive the mission, something that was not honestly disclosed by Soviet authorities for decades. But the message was unmistakable. The Soviets were not just first. They appeared to be far ahead. American attempts to respond initially went badly. In December 1957, the United States attempted to launch its own satellite, Vanguard TV-3, in front of television cameras and the watching world. The rocket rose about 4 feet off the launch pad, lost thrust, and collapsed back down, exploding in a fireball. Newspapers mockingly called it Flopnik, Kaputnik, Stay Putnik. It took until January 1958 for the United States to successfully launch its first satellite, Explorer 1, using a rocket developed by a team led by a German engineer named Wernher von Braun. And here is where the story gets morally complicated in a way that history often does not like to discuss honestly. Von Braun had been the chief architect of Nazi Germany's V-2 rocket program during the Second World War. The V-2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, and it was built using forced labor from concentration camp prisoners at an underground facility called Mittelwerk, where conditions were so brutal that more people died building the V-2 rockets than were killed by the rockets themselves when they struck London and other cities. At the end of the war, the United States launched an operation called Paperclip, secretly recruiting von Braun and dozens of other German rocket scientists, bringing them to America, and in many cases deliberately obscuring or minimizing their Nazi affiliations and wartime activities in official records. Von Braun would go on to become one of the most important figures in the American space program, eventually leading the team that designed the Saturn V rocket that would carry astronauts to the moon. It is one of the more uncomfortable truths embedded in this story. The rocket technology that achieved one of humanity's most inspiring accomplishments was built on a foundation that included Nazi war crimes and forced labor. Progress and moral compromise, intertwined, as they so often are in history. The Soviet space program continued to lead through the late 1950s. In 1959, Soviet probes became the first man-made objects to reach the moon, and the first to photograph its far side, a hemisphere no human being had ever seen, since the moon's rotation keeps the same face permanently turned toward Earth. Then, on April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union achieved its most dramatic triumph. Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old fighter pilot, became the first human being to travel into space, orbiting the Earth once aboard a spacecraft called Vostok 1. Gagarin's flight lasted just under 2 hours. He experienced weightlessness, watched the curve of the Earth from orbit, and became, almost instantly, one of the most famous human beings on the planet. He was a global celebrity, paraded through cities around the world, a living symbol of Soviet technological and ideological triumph. For the United States, this was another devastating blow. The Soviets had been first into orbit with a satellite, first to the moon with a probe, and now first to put a human being into space. The new American president, John F. Kennedy, who had taken office just months before Gagarin's flight, faced enormous pressure to respond. The American space program, meanwhile, was still struggling. Just weeks after Gagarin's flight, the United States managed only a 15-minute suborbital flight by astronaut Alan Shepard, a far less impressive achievement. And then came a disaster that, while not space-related, added to the sense of American vulnerability and humiliation. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in April 1961 was a foreign policy catastrophe that made Kennedy's young administration look weak on the world stage. Kennedy needed a victory. He needed something that would demonstrate, decisively, American technological and ideological superiority. He found it in an idea his advisors had been discussing. Not simply competing with the Soviets in the areas where they already led. Choosing an entirely new goal, one so audacious, so far beyond current capability, that whoever achieved it first would be unambiguously, undeniably ahead. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and made one of the most consequential promises in American history. He said that the United States should commit to the goal, before the decade was out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. At the time he said this, the United States had accumulated a grand total of 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. NASA did not yet have a rocket powerful enough to reach the moon. It did not have a spacecraft capable of carrying astronauts there. It did not have the navigation technology, the life support systems, or the landing capability required. It was, by any reasonable engineering assessment at the time, an almost impossible promise. What followed was one of the largest, most expensive, and most technically demanding peacetime projects ever undertaken by any nation in human history. The Apollo program would eventually cost the United States approximately $25 billion in the currency of the time, equivalent to well over $150 billion today. At its peak, the program employed around 400,000 people directly, and involved roughly 20,000 companies and universities across the country. The scale of the engineering challenge is almost impossible to overstate. NASA needed to develop, essentially from scratch, technologies that did not exist. A rocket powerful enough to send a spacecraft to the moon, the Saturn V, which remains to this day the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown, standing taller than a 36-story building and generating more thrust at launch than 85 Hoover dams. They needed guidance computers capable of navigating across 240,000 miles of space with enough precision to enter lunar orbit and then land on a specific spot on the surface, using computing power that, by today's standards, was almost laughably primitive. The Apollo guidance computer had less processing power than a modern calculator, and yet it had to perform calculations precise enough to mean the difference between a successful landing and a fatal crash. They needed spacesuits capable of protecting human beings in the vacuum of space and on the airless, radiation-exposed surface of the moon, where temperatures swing between scorching heat and frigid cold depending on whether sunlight is striking the surface. They needed a landing craft capable of descending to the lunar surface and then launching back into orbit to rendezvous with a command module orbiting above, using an approach called lunar orbit rendezvous that many engineers initially considered too risky and too complicated, requiring an entirely new kind of orbital docking maneuver that had never been attempted. And they needed to do all of this while keeping human beings alive, a problem more complex than most people realize. Every system, every component, every line of code had direct consequences for whether the astronauts inside would live or die. There was no margin for the kind of failure rates that were considered acceptable in less critical engineering projects. The program did not proceed without catastrophic loss. On January 27, 1967, during a routine launch pad test, a fire broke out inside the Apollo 1 command module. The pure oxygen atmosphere inside the capsule, combined with a spark from likely faulty wiring, created conditions for the fire to spread with terrifying speed. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were unable to open the complex, inward-opening hatch in time. All three died. The disaster forced a complete re-evaluation of spacecraft safety. The hatch design was changed to allow rapid emergency opening. The pure oxygen atmosphere on the launch pad was replaced with a less flammable mixture. Wiring and materials throughout the spacecraft were redesigned to reduce fire risk. It was a devastating loss, and a sobering reminder that this entire endeavor was being conducted at the very edge of human engineering capability, with real human lives paying the price for any miscalculation. The program continued. Unmanned test flights of the Saturn V rocket. Manned missions testing systems in Earth orbit. And then, in December 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed mission to leave Earth orbit entirely, traveling to the Moon, orbiting it 10 times, and returning safely. It was during this mission that astronaut William Anders captured one of the most famous photographs in human history. Known as Earthrise, it showed the Earth, small, blue, fragile, rising above the barren gray horizon of the Moon. For the first time, human beings could see their entire world as a single small object suspended in the vast darkness of space. The photograph is credited by many historians with helping to spark the environmental movement, a profound shift in human consciousness about the fragility and unity of our planet. By the summer of 1969, NASA had completed the testing necessary to attempt an actual lunar landing. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969, from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, carrying 3 astronauts. Neil Armstrong, the mission commander; Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot; and Michael Collins, the command module pilot, who would remain in lunar orbit while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface. The journey to the Moon took 3 days. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin separated the lunar module, named Eagle, from the command module, named Columbia, and began their descent toward the surface. The landing itself came perilously close to disaster. As the lunar module approached the surface, computer alarms began sounding, indicating that the guidance computer was being overloaded with more data than it could process. Mission Control, working with engineers who had anticipated this exact problem during simulations, determined the alarms could be safely ignored and gave the crew the go-ahead to continue. Then, as Armstrong looked out the window during the final approach, he realized the computer was guiding them toward a boulder-strewn crater that would have destroyed the spacecraft on landing. He took manual control, flying the lunar module himself, searching for a clear landing site while fuel ran dangerously low. With less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, by some estimates, Armstrong found a clear patch of ground and landed. His words to Mission Control, the first communication confirming the landing, have become legendary. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Inside Mission Control in Houston, grown men who had spent years of their lives on this project, engineers and flight controllers known for their stoic professionalism, broke into tears and cheers. 6.5 hours later, Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder of the lunar module and became the first human being to set foot on another world. His words, broadcast to an estimated 600 million people watching on television around the globe, became among the most famous ever spoken. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz Aldrin followed him onto the surface minutes later, describing the lunar landscape with a phrase that has also entered history: "Magnificent desolation." They spent about 2.5 hours outside the lunar module, collecting samples of lunar rock and soil, setting up scientific instruments, and planting an American flag, before returning to the lunar module, resting, and then beginning the journey back to rendezvous with Michael Collins in lunar orbit. On July 24, 1969, Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. The mission had succeeded completely. Kennedy's seemingly impossible promise, made 8 years earlier when the United States had barely managed 15 minutes of human spaceflight, had been fulfilled with 5 months to spare before the end of the decade. 6 more Apollo missions would follow, 5 of which successfully landed astronauts on the Moon, with one dramatic exception. Apollo 13, launched in April 1970, suffered a catastrophic oxygen tank explosion on the way to the moon, crippling the spacecraft and threatening the lives of its three-man crew. What followed was one of the most remarkable improvised rescue operations in the history of human spaceflight, with engineers on the ground and astronauts in space working together to jury-rig life support systems, conserve power, and navigate the crippled spacecraft on a path around the moon and back to Earth using the lunar module as a makeshift lifeboat. The mission, which never landed on the moon, became famous for an entirely different reason. It demonstrated human ingenuity and resilience under almost unimaginable pressure and ended with all three astronauts returning safely to Earth, an outcome that Flight Director Gene Kranz and his team achieved through extraordinary improvisation and calm, methodical problem-solving in the face of what seemed like certain disaster. The last Apollo mission to land on the moon, Apollo 17, took place in December 1972. Since then, no human being has traveled beyond low Earth orbit. No human being has walked on the moon, or anywhere else beyond our planet, for over 50 years. This is one of the strangest and most underappreciated facts about the entire space race. We achieved something so difficult, so audacious, so far beyond what should have been possible with the technology of the era, and then we largely stopped. The reasons were not technical. They were political and economic. The driving force behind Apollo had never really been scientific curiosity, however much genuine scientific value the program produced. It had been Cold War competition. Once the United States had unambiguously won that competition, demonstrated decisively that American technology and political will could outpace the Soviet Union, the political motivation to continue funding such an enormously expensive program began to fade. Public attention shifted. The Vietnam War was consuming enormous resources and political attention. Civil rights struggles, economic difficulties, and a growing sense that resources spent on space exploration might be better spent on problems here on Earth all contributed to declining support for ambitious space programs. NASA's budget, which had reached around 4% of the entire federal budget at the height of the Apollo program, declined dramatically in the years that followed, eventually settling at less than 0.5%, where it has remained, roughly, ever since. So what do we take from this extraordinary story, over half a century later? We take, first, a demonstration of just how much human beings can accomplish when sufficient resources, sufficient political will, and sufficient talent are aligned toward a single, clearly defined goal. The Apollo program succeeded not because any single technology was revolutionary, though many were, but because an entire civilization mobilized its scientific, engineering, and economic resources behind one specific, audacious objective with a fixed deadline. We take a recognition of the moral complexity embedded in even our greatest achievements. The same rocket technology that carried astronauts to the moon traced its lineage back to weapons designed by a regime responsible for some of history's worst atrocities, built in part using forced labor from concentration camps. Progress rarely arrives with clean hands. We take an understanding of how fragile the political will behind even our most inspiring projects can be. A goal that seemed to demand permanent, sustained national commitment was, in reality, contingent on a specific geopolitical competition. Once that competition was won, the will to continue evaporated remarkably quickly. And we take, perhaps most importantly, a sense of what is actually possible. 12 years. That is how long it took to go from a single beeping satellite, an achievement that terrified an entire nation, to 2 human beings walking on the surface of another world, watched by a sixth of humanity alive at that moment in history. 12 years. We are often told, about the great problems of our own time, that solutions are impossible, that the engineering challenges are too great, that the cost is too high, that the timeline is unrealistic. The history of Apollo suggests otherwise. It suggests that human beings, when sufficiently motivated, organized, and resourced, are capable of achievements that would have seemed like science fiction mere years before they were accomplished. The footprints that Neil Armstrong and the other Apollo astronauts left on the lunar surface are still there today, undisturbed, since there is no wind or weather on the moon to erase them. They will likely remain there for millions of years, a permanent record of 12 years in which human beings decided that something seemingly impossible was worth attempting. Whether we choose to attempt things of similar audacity again is a question each generation must answer for itself. This has been Sera History, Episode 13. If this story reminded you what human beings are capable of when we actually try, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We will be back. There are always more stories. History is not behind us. It is us.